Now I'd like to continue the conversation and bring in our panel. First, we have Tracy Keogh, Chief Human Resources Officer at HP, and Sarah Kaplan, Distinguished Professor at the University of Toronto and the author of The 360-Degree Corporation, From Stakeholder Trade-offs to Transformation. So Tracy, Sarah, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I wanted to start with you, Tracy. Right now, the world is experiencing an enormous remote work stress test. I have lots of questions about how that stress test is going and some observations about how it's going for me personally. But from your perspective, I suppose, both personally and having a kind of 30,000-foot view on this situation, how do you think our remote work experience is going?
So from an HP perspective, I can start there. It's been remarkable to see how quickly, Chip talked a little bit about this, but we moved on a dime to be able to get everyone home and safe, and with 55,000 employees around the world, without really missing a beat. We went from, I think, 3,000 Zoom calls a day to 35,000 at HP, and our IT system was able to hold it. And the thing that's impressive, I think, is people just figured out how to pivot. In some cases, we closed office within 2 or 3 days, and Chip talked a little bit about this as well, but, we did things around mobility that would have taken years to figure out in a matter of days. And so, we figured out how to close the books. We figured out how to do customer support, whatever it happened to be, R&D, all those things. And so we've been able to stay productive. Now, I have to say, personally, I didn't realize how productive I was in the office. I guess I must have just walked around and got things done quickly. I think for a lot of people, the 12 hours of Zoom calls a day really decreases your productivity. And it's very hard by the end of the day to get things done. And so I think we're learning new cadences and new ways of working to help keep us productive. But I've been impressed with what we've been able to accomplish in a really short time and continue to move the organization forward.
Yeah, just tell me a little bit more about that Zoom fatigue. I definitely know that I have felt it from time to time. Where do you think it comes from, and how is it being articulated to you? Like, how are people telling you what it feels like to be essentially on 35,000 Zoom calls collectively over the course of a month, I think you said.
A day. 35,000 a day is what we do. So, I think all of us know this. I think there's an intensity of connection when you're on Zoom, even versus when you would have a meeting and you sit in the back of the room and you might do your email during the meeting, or some people called in and I don't know what they were doing at home, versus everybody being super engaged and that connectivity. So I think there's an intensity that's exhausting, and people have written articles about why you get tired of Zoom. We've had people who are like, I'm an introvert. I can't stand all this face-to-face contact. My manager's making me use my video. So we've instituted, you don't have to use your video. And I can tell by the end of the day, people are often blocking their video because they're still on the call, but not in the same way. So, I think just that quick being able to get something done easily, isn't really as readily available. And now you schedule a Zoom call, so it just takes more time to do things. Some companies have reported, and some people, increased productivity because they don't have to commute the 2 hours they used to commute. And, I have to say I've been loving not traveling as much. And so there's a lot of things that are pluses and minuses, but I think we're all just getting to that new cadence and figuring out what makes sense. And then how do we translate this into the future? Because I feel like the future of work is now. What we were talking about is coming, is here. And so we're all figuring out how we focus on it. I think a big thing for us, too, is how do you really measure productivity in this environment? And that's something we need to help managers work.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a second. Sarah, I want to turn this to you. So, in thinking about how working through Zoom is in some ways sort of just a direct replacement for something like a one-on-one meeting, but in many ways having essentially a virtual office place, I think, does changed that which is sort of selected or elicited from workers. I think about the fact that, for example, I've always been someone who loves talking to people. I love being with people, talking to them, getting drinks with them, having meetings with them. I discuss talking about stories with my editor. I've always hated telecommunications. I haven't been good at keeping up with people, via phone and text. Like, I'm just not as good at that. And so in a way, this new Zoom world that we're living again somewhat selects against my communication preferences. Sarah, I'm wondering, in the reporting that you've done, whether you've noted any of the similar kind of changes, especially those that might break down in terms of gender equality, whether this sort of new Zoomed office might sort of scramble elements of gender relations and change the way that men and women work.
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack there. And the first thing I would say is not all of us have the luxury of working from home, and there's many essential workers who can't, and we have to keep those people in mind, and particularly in light of the conversations around Black Lives Matter, because we know many of those essential workers are people from marginalized groups. But when it comes to working from home, first of all, it may be harder for you and your type of person, but there are many people with disabilities who for years and years have been asking for exactly these accommodations. And it was always told that it was going to be too expensive or too complicated, or we didn't know how to do it. And suddenly, as the disability rights people would say, the ableds need these accommodations, they're made available. So these accommodations may actually work better for many kinds of people. When it comes to gender equality, one of the things we're discovering is that with all the kids at home and no childcare, it's hard to be productive at all if you have small children at home. And where you have at least two parents at home, there maybe are working shifts. There may be a positive aspect of that for men who hadn't historically been involved in childcare. They're discovering just how hard it is, and maybe that's going to increase sympathy. But we also know that many women, why there's been more unemployment of women during this crisis than men is in part because many women are having to drop out of the workforce to take care of children. And so we may see a generational impact of this time in terms of women being siphoned out of the workforce. So I think there's a lot of different dimensions to think about when we think about what work from home is really accomplishing.
Yeah. And I would say just one thing about that. I think it's really an incredible time, and we've trained our managers around diversity and inclusion, because you're in people's homes and you are dealing with their personal lives in a way that has never happened before, both managers or leaders and individual employees. And so you have to take into account, is it a single mom who's trying to manage a kid? Is it someone in a community that's had an outsized impact that COVID's hit them? You've got to understand the current situation. How are people dealing from a mental health standpoint? So we've actually had we call it mobility manager training. So managers are more sensitive in giving them strategies to deal with this environment.
Yeah, Sarah, I'm really glad that you brought up a couple points that we were going to jump into. The first is that, when you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and its reports on who can work from home, that number they estimated somewhere, if I recall, between 28 and 33%, which essentially means that 2/3 of jobs cannot be done remotely. I think a really important point to keep front of mind whenever we talk about how this is an experiment in the future of work. The other thing that I keep thinking about is the fact that when we've talked about the acceleration, we as people who talk about the future of work have talked about the acceleration of remote working and telecommuting, distributed workforces. People weren't imagining that we would have our first test case during a pandemic when kids weren't allowed to go to school. So a lot of people have had to undergo this test, this sort of time machine into a future of remote work, at the same time that their children literally are not allowed legally to leave the house in some cases, at least certainly in March, April, and early May. And so, Tracy, you brought up mental health. I'd love to hear you both talk about what you're looking at in terms of how this is affecting the mental health of individuals. You can talk about either parents. There's a clear challenge there, or if you'd like to talk about single individuals who are stuck at home. They have a relationship with their coworkers and maybe their friends and family over Zoom, but they can't leave the house and meet people for drinks, dinner, and walks in the park.
So I can start, Sarah, and then you can jump in, but I'll talk about what we've done as a company. So we quickly pivoted to support our employees, I would say in an unparalleled way because they needed it. We created, I call it programming, because we actually created motivational Mondays and training Tuesdays and well-being Wednesdays, and then thoughtful Thursdays where we actually do remote and virtual volunteerism. It's a big thing in our company. And then Fridays are our family and friend Fridays. And so we actually have been doing lots of different services around stress management, sleeping, ergonomics, how to deal in this environment. We have a medical director on staff, and we have doctor's hours every Wednesday so people can call in and ask questions. One of the most impactful things I did was a homeschooling seminar. I hired 4 teachers, and we had hundreds of employees trying to figure out how to do that, and then created something called homework clubs so we could support people as they were teaching their children. We identified virtual camps because now they thought homeschooling was bad. Now everybody's home for the summer with nothing to do. So, I think what we found is, first of all, you're not just supporting your employee, you're supporting the employee and their family because you're in their homes in an unprecedented way. Mm-hmm. And so that was really important. We call it the HP Spirit Calendar, and every Monday I send out the different things, and over 40% of our employees have engaged in some of these activities that we've been, and we see it growing every week. So that level of support for employees, I think, one, is at a higher level than I've seen anywhere else in my career, and will have to continue because I think people now have come to expect it because they need the support. Our EAP is up, all the different capabilities that we have to support people, and we sit there and figure out what those are. They look very different in the pandemic than they may have done beforehand.
Yeah, Sarah.
I would just say that just judging from my team and all the activities going on at my employer, the University of Toronto, is that some people are already barely holding it together and they just feel like, oh my goodness, I have to now go to some something. I think we have to also keep in mind that for many people with either any kind of care responsibility at home, or anybody with a mental health issue that's causing them to have a negative reaction during this time, that we have to change our expectations of what productivity looks like. We have to change our expectations of what times people can work. Half my team right now is working the 1 to 8 shift because that's when their spouse is taking care of their kids. So I can't schedule meetings with them before 1 p.m. That affects my productivity too. And I have to accept that because we have to understand the pressures that our teams are on. So I think more than providing additional services and things like that, which may be important, we also have to acknowledge what success in terms of job performance is going to look like, and maybe change those metrics. There's plenty of people following my feminist Twitter that I follow. There's plenty of people who just are barely holding it together because of all of their responsibilities, and asking people to do more in terms of participating in, the stress relief yoga. Like, that's literally something I don't have time for right now.
Right.
And I would say that, what we have our managers do is be inclusive. And for example, we had one manager who they invited the kids into their call. Right? Everybody had their kids on their lap. So they're supporting, it's okay to say, hey, I can't deal with this right now, is really important. We had, I know one head of HR said to me from another company, what are you doing about performance management? I'm like, performance management? How would you be evaluating people? This is a crisis, right? That you would be thinking that you're going to write up a review of someone. I think that's crazy. And so I think you want to be as supportive as you can to get through this with your employees, and not be looking at how are you evaluating them against some metric that existed in another environment in another time. I think it's all about support and connectivity.
Right. Sarah, I'm not exactly sure how to frame this question, but I think a lot of what you said is really interesting and provocative. And it made me wonder, whether it's possible at this horrible moment that is for so many people a family crisis, a mental health crisis, and even an existential crisis, whether because it's such a shock to the system and it so forces so many people, surely not everybody, but because it forces so many people and so many companies to think socially in a way that they haven't before, whether that might be a silver lining. And I don't want to suggest that like the pandemic's good because it forced people to think socially, but whether going forward, we might have a more socially aware, socially inclusive corporate and institutional environment because of the shock that was experienced in 2020.
Well, I think I agree with you. I don't want to be a Pollyanna in this situation. The combination of COVID and the disparate effect of COVID on marginalized communities, the incredible upheaval around Black Lives Matter and police brutality. These are all things we should mourn. But at the same time, I think because it's such a dislocation, I think there's a real opportunity to what I've been writing about, build back better, and to think about, okay, we shouldn't be trying to get back to the way things were, because it turns out the way things were embedded in systemic racism, in systemic sexism, in a whole bunch of disparate outcomes for people. And so we shouldn't want to go back to that situation. And so I think one thing that this crisis could do is create enough dislocation in how we have been doing things that we can entertain completely new ways of thinking about how we work, what corporate priorities are, what corporate governance looks like. All of these things, I think, are open to possibilities. And so I think we need to really come up with new futures and use this moment. For those of us who have the privilege of being able to even sit in a conversation like this, it is our responsibility to be really imagining completely new ways of working, and not just making statements about how important Black Lives Matter are, but really actually doing something radically different with how we run our organization, how we prioritize things, where we put our resources. So I think the idea of building back better is the only silver lining we can have in what is a moment where many people are mourning.
Yeah, I think it's really well put. Tracy, go right ahead.
Yeah, the one thing I was going to say, I think smart companies and organizations are looking, we've had a level of authenticity and connectivity with our people that's been unprecedented because we've gone through this together. And I think, we've seen an increase in employee engagement in our organization. On our last survey, the belief in our leadership went up 17 points because of how open our leadership is, and around all of these issues. It's amazing to see these. They are seismic changes, and unprecedented. And it's, I think, a time to really be supporting employees and everyone in your organization to be able to change how we all operate together in the most positive way possible. And I think smart companies are looking at how to do that, and organizations, so that we can make lasting change to be more inclusive of everyone.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it, like Minneapolis wants to, is going to dissolve its police force and create something new. We have the NFL commissioner now apologizing for censuring protests. So things we couldn't have imagined 2 months ago, we can imagine now. And I think we need to be at that level of boldness in the things that we imagine for the future.
All right, great. Let's end on that level of boldness then. Sarah, you first, and then to Tracy. I'd love to hear about specific policies that either, Sarah, you've heard of or you see happening at the University of Toronto that you hope or think will continue even as people do come back to campus or return to work. And then Tracy, from you, I'd love to hear after that, you tell me about a change that you think AHP will continue to hold on to even as people are moving back into their offices, how we can essentially preserve the lessons learned in this crisis for the post-crisis world. So Sarah, you first.
Well, first I will say that not to do with the University of Toronto, but one thing this crisis has highlighted is the importance of childcare. And I think that we do not have universal childcare in Canada or in the United States. And if we are going to achieve gender equality, we absolutely need to now invest in childcare. And the other thing I would say is, from a corporate priority standpoint, we need to move the Business Roundtable said they were going to move to considering all stakeholders and not just the shareholder. We need not just a statement, we need a clear roadmap, for example, of how they would take on the UN Sustainable Development Goals or other priorities. It's not enough to say something anymore. We have to see money and time and resources invested in these radical changes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say from our perspective, I think we will look at work completely differently. You know, how we collaborate, how we communicate, all these things will be changed. You know, people are not going to go back to the office in the same way. We want the level. We've always been a flexible company, but you know, working in the office maybe 2 days a week now. You know, and so I think, you know, communicating where we used to go around the world and have a meeting in a particular office, we can bring the whole leadership team anywhere in the world and do a Zoom call with the entire office with no wear and tear, you know, no pollution, any of those things. So, you know, I think everything will change in terms of how we look at things. We're rethinking a lot of our people strategies in terms of looking at it being a remote environment. And so I think everything we do will change because of this. And then on top of it, you've had the incredible impact of the last couple of weeks from a social justice standpoint. I think it's a very exciting time to be able to really, as Sarah says, take actions so that we can really change the systemic issues we have in our society. That's going to help all the world, but our businesses, our people, our shareholders, everything. So I think you'll see that definitely happening in the future.
Great. Tracy, Sarah, thank you so much. We'll leave it there. Thank you both for joining us today. And thanks to our audience for being with us as well. Now, John, back to you.